And Rome took in an equally huge quantity of precious metals, marble, and spices. So Rome gradually developed a more sophisticated economy following the creation of an agricultural surplus, population movement, and urban growth, and the spread of coinage, and most importantly, the need to feed Rome itself and supply its huge army wherever it might be on campaign. From the 2nd century BC to AD, there was a huge rise in the proportion of workers involved in the production and service industries and greater trade between regions in essential commodities and manufactured goods. These citizens rich enough to invest often employed slaves, freedmen, and agents to manage their business affairs. In terms of trade goods for Romans, the archaeological evidence of trade can sometimes be patchy, but a combination of archaeological ruins, literary sources, and coinage helps us to understand what the Romans traded, in what quantities, and the far-flung places where they ended up. Trade involved foodstuffs like olives, fish, meat, cereals, salt, wine, and beer, animal products like leather and hides, objects made from wood, glass, or metals, textiles, pottery, and materials from manufacturing, and construction such as glass, marble, wood, wool, bricks, gold, silver, copper, and tin. Many goods were produced as regional specialties on very large estates. That such large estates could produce a massive surplus for trade is something that we see in archaeological sites across the former Roman Empire. Wine producers in southern France had cellars capable of storing 100,000 liters of wine. An olive oil factory in Libya had 17 presses capable of producing 100,000 liters a year. Gold mines in Spain could produce 9,000 kilos of gold a year. Goods were transported across the Roman world, but there were limitations caused by a lack of land transport. Yes, there were Roman roads, but any kind of land transport could get expensive because of the pack animals you had to feed and maintain. No matter what, it remained cheaper to transport goods by sea rather than by river or land. It was 5 times cheaper to transport goods by river than land, and it was approximately 30 times cheaper to transport goods by sea than land. The wind is a free source of energy to move you instead of a pack animal. And a river can be cheap, but it only goes in one direction. You still have to return to your original destination, and that's why it's not as cheap as the sea. Although transport by sea was the cheapest and fastest method, you could get up to 1,000 nautical miles in 9 days. You were also more at risk at the elements, you could be subject to piracy, and at least in the Mediterranean, the period between November and March was too unpredictable for safe passage. And we have records of over 900 shipwrecks from the Roman period, so this happened quite a bit. Hey everyone, want to take a short break in this episode on our narrative on the Civil War. I want to mention a way how you can help support this show, and you can do so by saving big with a great new product from a company called Candid. Candid basically takes all of the misery out of adult orthodontia. There's millions of people at any given time in the United States who have wire braces, and there are many, many millions more who should be wearing retainers and aren't and need a tooth straightening solution. Well, Candid is a company that makes it possible to get tooth straightening without ever having to visit an orthodontist, without ever having to leave your home, and to get it all done much more cheaply and in a fraction of the time of conventional orthodontia. The way it works is that Candid sends a modeling kit to your home so you can take impressions of your teeth. After you send back your impressions with some photos of your teeth, a network of orthodontists reviews your case and provides you with a 3D preview of what your treatment will look like. After you receive your 3D preview, it's up to you if you want to go forward or not with a tooth aligner treatment plan. And when you get your treatment plan, it results in straighter and brighter teeth in an average of 6 months and can cost thousands of dollars less than braces. And again, no office visits are needed. Everything is delivered to your home. You can take advantage of Candid's risk-free modeling kit guarantee. And when you use my dedicated link, candidcode.com/unplugged, you'll save 25% off your modeling kit. That's candidcode.com/unplugged to get 25% off the price of your modeling kit. candidcode.com/unplugged. All right, now let's talk about these trade routes that go outside of the Roman Empire and really get to Karl's original question about how European influence manages to exert itself as far as possible in the classical age. Like I said, there were Indian and Arab merchants that would trade goods between the Roman world and the Indian world that would go along the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. This was one part of the world outside of Rome that people knew about. But what about other parts of the outside world? What did Romans think of northern regions, western regions, southern regions outside of Rome? Now, Northern Europe wasn't really a sphere that Romans concerned themselves with too much. It had lost a lot of its mystery from when Pythias originally made his way up there. England was by this time a Roman province, and traders knew about Scotland and Ireland. Roman troops had been operating in the Low Countries and Germany and what's now Belgium and the Netherlands. North of Germany, knowledge grew thin. Denmark, for example, was thought to be larger than it was, and Scandinavia was thought to be much smaller and actually an island. And if you get much further than that, then you get mythology taking over, where some claim that 5 days west of Britain, there's an island where Zeus had exiled his father Kronos. And 500 miles beyond that was a continent whose rivers poured out enough silt to make the Atlantic hard to cross. For Romans, Russia was considered outside the orbit of travel. Romans knew about the coast of the Black Sea, but practically nothing beyond that. Even a geographer like Claudius Ptolemy, located in Russia, the home of the Amazons, and other Scythian barbaric races out in Central Asia. But the most dramatic advances in knowledge from Rome concerns the Far East. In the early centuries of the Common Era, the two great civilizations of the ancient world, the Greco-Roman civilization and the Chinese, made contact with the consolidation of the Silk Road. This happened when, sometime after the death of Alexander, Chinese silk, which had been transported by caravan through Central Asia and passed along by a chain of middlemen, started to filter to the Mediterranean, and people realized the superiority of Chinese silk. In the second half of the 2nd century BC, the Chinese became more active in the trade and dispatched caravans on a regular basis. Here's where the Silk Road went. Starting in central China, in Baochi, which was the center of a complex of roads, these roads moved inside the Great Wall by way of Tianshui, and eventually to the western end of the wall and deep into Chinese Turkestan, which is getting into Central Asia, or Kazakhstan today. Between 118 and 114 BC, about 10 caravans a year were making the trip. On sea, between the Gobi Desert and the Tian Sha Mountains, the route forked into 3 branches to avoid the vast salt swamp in the Tarim Basin. 2 routes looped to the north and 1 to the south. The southern loop and one of the northern came together at Kashgar, then forked again to snake through the Pamir Mountains. This stretch was more or less a halfway point to the Mediterranean. All 3 of these routes were joined at Merv to continue across the desert. Merv is in modern-day Turkmenistan, and until it was destroyed by the Mongols, in the 1st century AD, it was one of the most populous, richest cities on Earth. It was a huge center of trade. Population, I think, was in the hundreds of thousands, enormously wealthy, and because of the Silk Road trade. So all 3 of these paths were joined at Merv to continue across the desert and join up with the tracks that led through Persia and Mesopotamia to the sea. Marco Polo famously went across the entire Silk Road, but nobody really went the entire distance. If you were in a caravan, if you were a cameleer who handled the 2 humped camels that were part of the caravan, if you were a trader, if you were a silk or spice merchant, you only went a short leg of the journey, and that was a leg you constantly went back and forth on, where you would trade goods to other middlemen and other brokers on either side of you. You would all know each other, and that was a little niche you carved out for yourself. Somewhere between Kashgar and Balkh was a place called Stone Tower, and I'm going to mention a Roman who visits this place. This is in modern-day Western China. And here, the Chinese turned their merchandise over to local Indian traders. The latter carried their share south to India and sent it the rest of the way by boat. Others plodded on into Persia, where they met up with Syrians and Greeks who took care of the final leg. So overland, this is how Rome came in contact with China, but it was all done indirectly. But there's one figure here I want to mention, a Roman, Gnaeus Titianus. He was an ancient Roman traveler of Macedonian background, and a Greek speaker who came from a family of merchants. Gnaeus went on an expedition that's recorded as having traveled farther along the Silk Road from the Mediterranean world than any other person, and he went west to east. In the early 2nd century, when Rome wasn't at war with Parthia, which is in modern-day Iran, he and a traveling party reached the Stone Tower, or the Tash Turgan, He's credited in Ptolemy's geography, and it says in his account, Marinus tells us that a certain Macedonian named Maen, or Maius Titianus, son of a merchant father, and a merchant himself, noted the length of his journey to the stone tower, although he did not come here in person, but sent others there. Now what's interesting is that we have Chinese sources that relate his expedition. When his expedition reached this part of western China, the Chinese general Ban Chao of the Han Empire intercepted the group and took them eastward to the Chinese capital, Luoyang. They were brought before the Han Emperor He, and the travelers spoke Greek and were with Parthian merchants. Chinese records write that the encounter took place in about 100 AD. So the merchants offered tribute to Emperor He by giving Syrian silks and imperial gold coins that had the image of Emperor Trajan. They were given Han silks as diplomatic gifts and sent back on their way back to Syria. It took 12 months to return home, totaling 2 years for the whole round trip. When they returned, knowledge of their experience spread around the Roman world. And for the first time, Romans learned of a superpower in the Far East that produced huge quantities of silk and steel. Maius Titianus wrote an account of the journey taken by his merchants, but only a brief summary of his work survives in the writings of Ptolemy. So maybe other Romans read his account, but we don't know. So as you can see here, there are lots of travelers who are trying to get around all these middlemen on the Silk Road, because if you can get around them, you can save an extraordinary amount of money on precious items, silk, some of the most expensive luxury goods in the Roman Empire, and make a fortune. This is what kicks off the Age of Discovery, because sailors and navigators want to make a fortune by bypassing the Silk Road and all these merchants and middlemen. The Western world was also able to reach the Chinese by water. Ever since Eudoxus was able to get around the Arab monopoly on the sea trade with India, India had become increasingly integrated in the network of Greco-Roman trade. From the beginning of the 1st century, fleets of ocean-going freighters sailed there yearly, not just to the Indus Valley, but all along the coast down to the tip of the peninsula. There were agents of Greco-Roman trading companies who had their homes in India, little trade colonies, who settled down in separate little foreign quarters. They exported a variety of Indian products like cinnamon, nard, cotton, pepper, and silk. Some of this Chinese silk came in overland, but a large part of it arrived by sea in Indian or Malay ships. The Chinese themselves didn't get into overseas shipping until centuries later. So it was inevitable that Westerners would move into this portion of the trade, and by the end of the 2nd century, Western freighters had ventured into the waters east of India, cutting across the mouth of the Bay of Bengal to trade with Malay, Sumatra, and Java. Here they discovered cloves to add to their list of spices they dealt in. What drew them on more than anything else was a desire to get closer to the source of silk. A Chinese account mentions that in the 9th year of the Yanqi period, during the Emperor Huanti's reign, or in 166, the king of Tatsin sent an embassy which, from the frontier of Annam, offered ivory, rhinoceros, horns, and tortoise shells. These are Roman emissaries offering their own luxury goods. So Tatsin is the Chinese name for the Roman Empire, and Antun is Antoninus, the family name of Marcus Aurelius. The account goes on to comment about the ordinary gifts the embassy had brought for the emperor. For example, there were no jewels. So most likely it wasn't an official body, but a group of shippers who were trying to buy their silk directly from China instead of through middlemen. So these are contacts between Rome and China, but the contacts, whether by land or sea, were always tenuous and never regular. Shipments of Chinese goods did come into the Mediterranean year in and year out. Cinnamon leaf and jade and other items, as well as silk and Greco-Roman statuettes and jewelry and pottery, made the journey the other way. But there was rarely a direct exchange. There were always merchants and middlemen, particularly from India, that linked the different branch roads of the Silk Road. The distance was just simply too great. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Now, what's fascinating is, even though the two sides didn't have a lot of direct contact with each other, we can see that there were goods passed between the two sides, sort of like a very, very long game of telephone, And that means we see Roman items ending up in China and Far East Asia, and we also see the opposite happening